Okay, here's the deal. After some very brief opening remarks by myself, I'm going to ask each of the speakers to come up and present in order of the where they appear in the program, and then once they finish, they'll all come back up on stage to answer questions. Okay? Now, let me be a little provocative, in the interest of getting good debate going. Okay? And basically, I think you can, on the whole, when we're talking about the debate on climate change, there are basically three kinds of people. The first are the soothsayers. The soothsayers. And they say, whatever problems there may be, they're not serious. And then there's the doomsayers, who are often predict an imminent Gotterdammerung. Okay? When such predictions lead to hasty government actions, we often get needless waste and very little or negative help in coping with problems of climate change. Of course, the poster child is these heavy subsidies, and they were just increased by Congress, the heavy subsidies on ethanol from corn. This is another example of the election year follies. I have taken to calling this kind of behavior electile dysfunction. Even in the face of ever-growing evidence of the futility of ethanol from corn, we increase them and we place heavier demands. And of course, we don't get any energy savings, certainly in the next 10 to 20 years, and we get heavy environmental costs right from day one in the form of river pollution and ocean pollution. Okay, now we get to the doom slayers. We've talked of soothsayers and doomsayers, and now we get to the doom slayers. And that's what we tried to bring you here today. We tried to bring you a group of doom slayers, people, resourceful people, who recognize that we do have a problem. Yes, we do. And they recognize also that there are available, sensible solutions to climate change. There are people who generally understand the need for refining and adjusting policies as we go along and learning from our mistakes, just as we have all learned from the early mistakes of cap and trade in Europe. And those were good lessons, and we've learned a lot from them, okay? Now, two other quick comments on issues raised this morning. Someone raised the question, I think it was Senator Kerry, or no, it was a question to him, about sustainability of water supplies. Well, unfortunately, virtually all public discussion of this issue ignores the ill effects worldwide of underpricing of water resources, okay? We have seemed not to have learned any lessons at all from the incredible train wreck that was the Russian experiment on irrigation from the Aral Sea for cotton. And that sea retreated. It's now 35% at most of its former area. And why? 20 years ago, I reviewed it. I reviewed study after study after study. Not one got to the real reason. What was the real reason? Zero price for water. Zero. And of course, when the water or anything is priced at zero, people will waste it. And then there was a comment this morning on elasticity pessimism. And the speaker this morning asserted that owners of autos and trucks are not responsive to changes in relative prices of gasoline and diesel fuel. This is true with a short run. Yes, this is true. We know this. But given time, we have seen that consumers and industry, when they're making decisions on their vehicle purchases, the truck and car fleet adjusts. Okay? And we do see savings from that. We don't get savings in the short term. But of course, a big problem of policymaking around the world is the heavy focus on the short term instead of the long term. And it's sometimes due to this election cycle that I just referred to. Okay. And by the way, the post-war history of the whole world has a major lesson for us, and that That is, that the world is littered with the wreckage of human misery from policies based on the assumption that long-run elasticities of demand and of supply are low. And you see this over and over again in agricultural policy all over the world, including the United States and Africa and Latin America, in industrial policy, monetary policy, trade policy, and yes, energy policy. Okay, now, I had all to say I'm going to get. So I'm going to introduce each speaker one by one. And first, I'm pleased to introduce Dimitri Zinkalis, and I hope I pronounced it correctly. Zinkalis, is that the right? Who is the head of the Stern Review team. My friend Nick Stern directed the Stern report that came out in '06 and made such a big splash. And so Dimitri is going to tell you why. You have the floor.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks to Rice University for inviting me to talk to you here today. I'm going to keep with the fine tradition of, ineffectual tradition of talking fast, but probably not saving time. I'm going to try and save time, though. But I've had a few people that have come up to me and said, oh, you've got to talk about competitiveness, and oh, you've got to talk about the discount rate, and you've got to talk about your treatment of risk. So what I can't do, of course, is go through the entire review in this space of time. So forgive me if I skip through some bits, but dwell a little bit on some of the things which I think are particularly pertinent to this story. This is one of the bits I'm going to skip past pretty quickly, not least because you've seen it already. But effectively, it's that chart that shows the shows the impact of climate change in terms of temperature changes relative to pre-industrial. An earlier speaker mentioned that the intensities of the arrows show increasing impacts. They also show increasing risks, and I think that's important to mention, because a lot of the story on climate change is about risk. It's about temperature increases, but perhaps most importantly, it's about water, both too much of it and too little of it. Clearly, as you get to 5 degrees, all the indicators are flashing red, but one thing I want to get across is that at 3 degrees, and you'll see why 3 degrees is not an arbitrary figure, 3 degrees already gets you into territory where up to 1 billion people are suffering from water stress and malnutrition, and between 20 and maybe up to 50% of the Earth's species become extinct. The reason why 3 degrees is important is it's probably where we will aim at if we get early collective action on mitigating emissions. So it's almost it's the challenge to limit the damages to 3 degrees. This chart has the same horizontal axis, but shows what the science suggests is a mapping from the concentrations of greenhouse gases to temperature changes. I will not dwell on this either, except to say that we're already at around 430 parts per million CO2 equivalent. Again, reflecting probabilities, these are 90% confidence intervals based on 2 studies, Hadley and IPCC. Hadley because it was slightly more recent, 2004, and treated the probabilities in a more sophisticated manner. IPCC third assessment report because it was available at the time and was internationally recognized. The dotted grey bars show a number of 11 other studies, and you can see that, if anything, we've taken a more cautious view on the science. We certainly haven't gone for the more outlandish impact stories, but we felt that if there was a story to tell on this basis, there would clearly be a story to tell on something which showed even greater impacts. If we carry on as we are, we're at 430. We're adding a rate of about 2 parts per million per year in net flows, and that rate is rising. You do the maths, we get to 750 quite quickly in the next century, and 750 goes off the scale, but gives us a roughly 50-50 chance of getting to about 5 degrees, the right-hand side of that chart that we saw before. A very nasty place to be, not just because of the impacts we know about, but because the increasing risk of some thresholds and non-linearities and starting off systemic changes, the melting of the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheet, the depletion of the Amazon rainforest, the release of methane deposits, etc. Some of these were talked about this morning. 5 degrees doesn't sound like a lot, but you're an expert audience. You know that 5 degrees actually means an awful lot more on continental areas and has significant impacts on the climatic system. 5 degrees, the last time we were 5 degrees warmer, it's my understanding, was some 40 million or so years ago, when the Earth was characterized by swampy palm forests and alligators were found close to the poles. It's a very different kind of planet, and it is inconceivable that that kind of temperature change wouldn't cause, over so short a period of time, and that's the important point, would cause a dramatic change in the physical and human geography of the planet. The last ice age, we were about 5 degrees colder than where we are now, and there were glaciers, ice sheets over New York at that time. So that gives you a kind of idea of the magnitude. I mentioned 3 degrees before. 3 degrees is roughly where you'd get to with a 50-50 probability if we stabilized at 550 parts per million CO2. Now, if we'd started 10 years ago, and you'll see this later, that 450 might have been a good place to aim at. At the moment, 550 is probably going to be the most reasonable target for an emissions mitigation program. This chart doesn't say very much, except to say that our modeling studies of the climate sensitivity, the assumptions we put in, were not particularly funky either. Indeed, they were right in the middle. It's the page 2002 range of estimates on climate sensitivity, the temperature increase you get for a doubling of concentrations. And if anything, it was slightly below the IPCC estimate of climate sensitivity, which came out shortly after our report. So there's no bias in our scientific figures. It's important to state that. What does this show? Well, this, and I should say at this point that the important element of this story is given in that first chart, the disaggregated list of climate change impacts. Any model that tries to assess what's going to happen in 200 years' time, 100 years' time, 200 years' time on the basis of probabilities, using value judgments on future generations, is going to be wrong. No single estimate can be right. There can only be a range of estimates, and any attempt to talk about these kinds of estimates in a quantitative manner with certainty, it must be treated with great, great circumspection, which is why we devoted 1 chapter to this, whereas we laid out the analytical impacts over 4 or 5 chapters in the review. Nevertheless, of course, it was the 1 chapter that received the bulk of the attention. Everybody likes to have a number. So why did we undertake it, having given that caveat? Well, because we felt that the previous studies clearly didn't go far enough in presenting a realistic estimate of the full impacts of business as usual changes, damages, impacts, and risks from climate change. Why? Well, this matrix here gives you 2 dimensions. On the vertical, we've got uncertainty in projections. On the horizontal, we've got uncertainty in measurement. And the point here is that a lot of the studies that were in the literature before the Stern Review started, quite understandably and sensibly, by looking at what could be predicted with certainty and what could be measured. So that meant projections of some of the secular rises in sea levels, temperature changes, and market impacts. It's the top left-hand corner. Things you can measure, things with a price on them, GDP, the costs of adaptive measures, building levees, the impact on agriculture. As you go down and across to the right, as you go down, you've got to account for some of the uncertainties, precipitation events, and then the risks of catastrophes, these risks of nonlinear thresholds. Very few models tended to do that. Nordhaus and Boyer did, and Hope did. As you move across to the right, you're going to have to start measuring things with a non-market price, which are pertinent to this story, impacts on human health, on lives, and on the environment. And as you go right to the right, you've really got to look at things which can be characterized as socially contingent, the impact on water stress, on war, conflict, migration. Even we didn't go that far. We didn't put a number on that because we felt that it would hold the rest of the review to hostage if people started saying it's bad enough as it was. When people start to question the figure you've attached to a war in the year 2090, then you really will be in trouble. So we put a 0 there. But there's one thing you can be certain about. The impacts of climate change on conflict, migration, refugees, if you take, for example, the Nile stopping flowing through Cairo or Bangladesh being underwater, will not be 0. So our numbers are still biased on the downside in many respects. Nevertheless, they're closer than previous numbers, and they're probably characterized somewhere sort of there. The important point to take home here being that models in the literature have only a partial coverage of the impacts, and they're really just subtotals of the full impacts. And that's not to denigrate them in any way. You do want to start with what you can measure and what you can project, but it should be clear how we interpret these results. I was asked to talk about discounting, so I shall very quickly. Why is discounting such a problem here and such an important feature of this problem? Well, and this is the good side, it forces you to make explicit what your value judgments are about how you value future generations, how you value people of different incomes. And I think it's important that, therefore, this launched a discussion. But, of course, it shouldn't be the case that your assessment of the case for action, which is based on a detailed analysis of that first picture, shouldn't be held hostage over technical adjustments to some of these valuations. So what are the do's and don'ts? I just scrabbled this together this morning. The do's and don'ts of discounting. Well, and indeed we did, discount the future if it's going to be richer. We used, the economists in the room will be familiar with the diminishing marginal utility of consumption, which just says that every additional dollar of consumption given to a street child in Calcutta will yield an awful lot more welfare and utility than it will if you hand it to Bill Gates, who probably won't even thank you for it. Maybe he will. I don't know. I don't want to talk the great entrepreneur down. In any case, it's also the reason why we're risk averse. You're more fearful of losing your income, all else equal, than you are gaining an equivalent amount of income, which is why we pay money into insurance markets in the extreme. Everybody would like their income to double. They'd like it very much, I'm sure, but if you had your income fall by that same absolute amount, you'd be dead. So you would probably miss that value of that income more than you would through gaining the same amount again. So you've got both aversion to risk and a reason to discount people who are richer than relative to people who are poorer. It's a sort of the egalitarianism. So that's very, very important, and that indeed is why we did discount future generations. We had a number of, there's no such thing as the discount rate. We had a number of projections, and the discount rate is endogenous to those because the impact of climate change on incomes will depend on the projection. Making that parameter even more egalitarian, the degree to which each additional increment of consumption yields utility. If you want to be even more egalitarian, care even more for poor people, and that was an argument that was given by some as to why we hadn't discounted enough, you would think that makes you discount the future even more. Well, yes, it does to begin with, but if you actually increase the climate sensitivity, which a lot of the science says you should, and you allow for risks and uncertainties and probabilities, which you must, actually that relationship is non-linear. For low levels of egalitarianism and low levels of impacts, as you increase both, your assessment of the impacts goes down. But at a certain point, that turns around. Why? Very intuitive. If you really are egalitarian and you care about small risks of very large impacts that leave people poorer, that soon begins to swamp the results. So changes to that nature of that egalitarianism doesn't necessarily change the story. And we were criticized on both sides. Some said we were too egalitarian, some said we weren't enough. Do also discount for existential risk, and we had a 0.1% discount rate for that. You care about present generations more than you do future ones because they exist. We don't know whether we're even going to be here. We might have been hit by a meteorite or blown ourselves up in nuclear Armageddon, so we've got to factor that into our calculations. But do not discount for agent-relative perspectives. The fact that we care about ourselves more than other people care about, more than we care about future generations, or indeed we might care about people in this room and in our immediate communities more than we do people in obscure villages in Africa, doesn't mean that we really are more valuable than those people. It's an agent-relative assumption. And unlike the spatial agent relativity, it's also time inconsistent. Because as time rolls on, the future generations will become the agents. And so the decisions made will never be right for future generations. You'll be sequentially making wrong decisions, which with time will appear wrong. And we're not wackos in this kind of notion that we've applied a zero discount rate. Not only is it wrong, but even this zero pure time preference, we're in good company. The likes of Pigou, Amartya Sen, John Maynard Keynes, even non-economists know these names, all said that this is the appropriate way to treat pure time preference over the long run. Do ethical parameters feel right? Well, this is a key question. Do our discount rates appear wrong? Well, let me just start by saying where not to look for discount for ethics is in short-term interest rates. If you look at long-term risk-free interest rates, then the discount factors that we've applied are broadly in line with some of those market rates. But short-term rates, as a number of economists have suggested, are completely the wrong place to look. Short-term interest rates are derived from the interactions of consumption, saving, and investment decisions amongst consumers and producers. Now, I don't know how you plan your finances, but I know that when I look at my savings and pensions, there is is one date of disproportionate importance, that's the date I expect to die. I don't have children. What goes on beyond there seems a little bit, slightly abstract as far as I'm concerned. That does not mean that I don't care about the future. That does not mean that I don't care about climate change. If I did, I wouldn't be in this room talking to you guys. So trying to extract ethics from short-term market rates is just looking in the wrong place. But to come back to this question about do the ethical parameters feel right, those that say, well, actually, we should discount the future. It's not a failing of the imagination, as I think it was Pigou once described it, but that we should add another 2 or 3% onto our pure time preference. And by the way, short-term interest rates suggest that we should do that anyway, because that's the ethics derived by individual agents when they plan their savings and pensions and investments. Well, if you do add 2 or 3 or 4%, then you give future generations at the end of next century a weight of something like 1 over 100, maybe 1 over 200 of the weight you give generations today. It doesn't sound like much adding a couple of percent, but look what it does. It pretty much does away with the problem. If you have such a low estimation of the value of generations beyond 100 years, then you don't need the science, you don't really need the economics, you've predetermined your results and you can walk away from this problem. And it's a trick that many, including Bjorn Lomborg, and I would argue almost to some extent Bill Nordhaus as well, have applied. It really removes the need to act. And does it pass the sniff test? Does it reflect the way most people think about this? Well, frankly, I think most people, when they do accept the science and when they do look at the impacts, don't think that this is the appropriate moral valuation to input. Again, we wouldn't be in this room and politicians wouldn't be talking about this issue if it was. So I think our discounting assumptions are theoretically correct. We're looking in the right place. We're using the right methodology. And they have a good feel. They pass the test of looking and sensing and feeling appropriate. This is a story we all know. We're now switching from stocks to flows. The flow into the atmosphere in terms of emissions around and above 40 gigatons for CO2 equivalent per year. That's going to double by mid-century, above 80. Where do we need to go to? Well, it's a stock flow mechanism. Think of a water tank. The flows in have got to be equal to the flows out. So we've got to reduce emissions to the Earth's natural capacity to absorb greenhouse gases. That's going to be below 10, maybe 5. That's the nature of the challenge. We're at 40, we're going to 80, and we've got to get to 5. So at this point, people walk out the room because they think this is just, it's just pie in the sky. It's impossible to do. Well, actually, 450 probably is impossible to do. If we were to try and stabilize from starting at 430 to a concentration of 450, the brown line shows what emissions need to do. They've got to fall by something like 10%, maybe up to 10%, after peaking pretty much tomorrow. That's going to hurt. It's going to require scrapping capital. It's going to require bringing on technologies before they're mature. Had we started 10, 20 years ago rather than wasted time, 450 might well have been achievable. It's almost certainly too expensive to do now. What about 550? That's the orange line. 550 we can do. Requires a much more relaxed profile. Emissions peak by 2020 and then decline by 1 or 2% thereafter. But it's important to note, if we hang around for another 20 years, 550 will probably be beyond our affordable grasp. So every 10-year delay almost doubles the annual rate of decline that's required. So what does that mean in terms of cost? This is another area of controversy. Well, we argued that strong mitigation could cost as little as 1% of GDP per annum worldwide. Now, there's a split opinion here, and correctly, there's you've got on the one hand there's a view that this is all this actually is going to render. It's going to kind of bring in a brave new world. Attempt to reduce emissions, going to yield efficiency gains. It's going to yield innovation that's going to actually leave us in 50 years' time richer than we would have been otherwise. A huge market failure in technologies and in efficiency, so we all end up better off. At the other extreme, there's the equally plausible argument that, in fact, the challenge is enormous. We've got India and China. Emissions profiles are probably a lot stronger than a lot of the projections. Decarbonizing all of that lot and doing it effectively is going to be absolutely burdensome and expensive. Now, we said 1% would be what you could get to if the world acted in tandem, if there was a broadly uniform carbon price, and if we move very, very quickly. It does not mean that 1% is where we will end up. Almost certainly, the world will not act in tandem. Almost certainly, we will delay. Almost certainly, a lot of the application of mitigation policy will be piecemeal and inconsistent. And the cost will be above 1% on average. Of course, there's a plus or minus 3 depending on technologies, depending on oil prices. 1% is the mean. So 1% is where we could get to if we acted as a mean expectation. But it doesn't mean we will get there. And I think that's important to recognize that if we do this badly and if we do it late, it will cost a lot more. Where did this 1% come from? It came from an assessment of both bottom-up and top-down models. Top-down models are fine, but the problem with top-down models is the devil's in the detail, a lot of behavioral assumptions, and you need to know what you're looking at. The other problem with top-down models, which actually may tend to overstate the cost, is they cannot represent all the substitution opportunities available in an economy. If you have only a narrow bunch of sectors, say you only had transport, you either pay a carbon tax or a carbon price, or you move out of transport. That doesn't leave you with much choice. Or even if you have 2 transport options, the more options you have, the more substitution possibilities you have, the less the cost. And that's the nature of the real world. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. The other method was to look at bottom-up studies, and they just said, look, here's a chunk of mitigation we have to do. What's it going to cost with the kind of technologies that we can anticipate over the future? And they both came to this more or less 1% plus or minus 2 or 3 type number if policy is applied efficiently. Big if, an important if. Costs won't be evenly distributed. To the extent that policy is applied the world over, some areas, some sectors, some countries will be hit harder than others. Why? They're more greenhouse gas intensive, or for any given greenhouse gas intensity, they don't have as many substitution opportunities. Well, that's kind of means we might need to help certain disproportionately hit areas, but it doesn't mean we want to stop the medicine working. You want to price those greenhouse gas intensive areas. So some sectors are going to have to hurt. If no sectors are suffering, then the medicine's not working. Slightly different is the transitional impact. If countries move at different speeds, then you have a problem because then you have the possibility of relocation, of loss of market shares. You have transitional impacts you need to look at, but you also have this problem that you might actually shift the pollution somewhere else. So not only are you causing disproportionate pain potentially for those countries that move first, but you're also not resolving the problem. So that needs to be looked at. The analysis, and I don't have time to talk about this in any great detail, but the analysis suggests that for very good reason, competitive relocation is not not as major a threat as some would have it believe that it would be, especially if we are in a world where, in fact, we are going to become carbon constrained, as increasingly we all recognize we are. Actually, the incentive to game on competitiveness starts to move the other way, and you lose opportunities if you don't move early. You can't set the regulatory system. You can't determine the new technologies. You take others' processes. You can't work with the investment cycle in building up your infrastructure. So actually, the incentive to drag your heels begins to change very, very quickly once you recognize that the world is becoming carbon constrained and key markets are beginning to become carbon constrained. I'm not going to talk about that. Now this, you either love it or hate it, and I'd say I'm sort of in between. But it points out 2 very nice things, this McKinsey cost curve, which I'm not going to talk through. I assume most of you have already seen it. It shows that there are these many, many substitution opportunities. Indeed, within each sector, there'll be some areas and some sectors which are most suited to, say, any one of these solar. Some places are very well suited for solar, some places are not. Inevitably, a world in which we mitigate is going to be one where you've got a number of big scheme, CCS, renewable generations, but also small changes, pumping up your tires, switching off your televisions, not having your rechargers on. Bit of deforestation here, a bit of land use there, a bit of transport fuel mix changes, etc., etc., etc. It's the wealth of these potential opportunities that can keep the cost of the bulk of this fairly low. The other thing that, of course, stands out like a sort of elephant in the room is that area under the curve here, which just says, hey, there's loads of free lunches here that we haven't taken advantage of. If you address climate change, you actually save money as well. And economists tend to sort of look at that with dismay because, of course, the price system would have led to optimal behavior and you wouldn't have these free lunches sitting around. Now, I have some sympathy with that as an economist, but only some. And I only have to introspect into my own life to look at how many inefficiencies arise, and how I'm not homo economicus. I don't go down when I buy a domestic appliance with my calculator and work out the payback period. I tend to get the cheapest one and the one with a nice color. Does that save me money? Almost certainly not. I have started, actually, closing my windows, turning my thermostat down, switching the lights off. Is that because I've suddenly woken up to the great efficiency gains and opportunities that are available in terms of monitoring my electricity bill every time? Oh, God, no, I don't have time. Life's too short for that. But I care about the planet. So here's an example in my own life where climate change action by myself, not by a government, has actually yielded these positive economic gains. The point here being that businesses and individuals just don't have the time. The information takes time to gather. There are administrative costs. So we don't bother, each and every one of us, all making these small gains. But if governments were to mandate, control, and regulate, we'd all be better off. And then we see that in car emissions, we see that in domestic appliance standards, we see that in building standards. We're better off for them because we would never have undertaken those efficiencies. So it's not as crazy as it sounds. I'm going to skip that. And I'm going to pretty much finish off, actually, with just a quick word on policy mechanisms. I would have liked, actually, to talk more about policy mechanisms because in the Bali Action Plan and the run-up to Copenhagen, this is probably the most important part of the story, and it's certainly the area that we're focusing on. What are the three policy principles that we think are most important? Well, you have to begin with pricing the externality. You have to begin with markets that efficiently reflect the damage that's been done by production and consumption activities which emit greenhouse gases. And that's equally the same point I made before about some sectors will have to be pinched. There's no way you can avoid that. I'm not going to talk too much about tax or trade, but I will say this. One of the elements that makes trade more important, I think, to some extent more attractive than tax, and it's a worry I have because I've been traveling around the US in the last week, and I've noticed that there's some fantastic research in developing a really efficient or the optimal mitigation strategy for the US, but I worry time and time again that the US is treating the rest of the world as exogenous and out of its control. Now that could be a very dangerous mistake because you have to look at the reaction function of US policies on the rest of the world. And if you're clumsy with border tariffs or you're not willing to send technology or financial support to developing countries, then they may not buy into this global deal. And America could spend a lot of money and pedal very hard, but if China is developing 2 power stations a week and not allowing for retrofitting of carbon capture and storage, your money is as good as wasted. You really have to think about how your policies actually impact the rest of the world. And the advantage of carbon trading is it does allow for low mitigation cost options across the developing world to sell credits into your markets. The counterparty of that is that you send money into those countries. They make a profit out of it. It gives them an incentive to participate, but it also saves you money as a country because you can undertake mitigation opportunities where they might be cheapest. You've got to make sure that it does what it says on the tin, and these are verifiable and accredited. And we need to think about how we scale up these projects to programs, to sectoral benchmarks, to technology benchmarks. But it does require that we provide an incentive for developing countries to participate by offering them financial and technology transfers. Technology being the second key area. We've spoken already that price mechanisms are important, but they can't do the whole trick. You will need to go beyond price mechanisms because innovation is an externality that suggests that the private sector will not, even with certainty over future prices, will not undertake the optimal innovation. You need, to some extent, to supply support for that. The risks are too high, they're too long term. The gains are often, the spillovers are public, and the private sector can't capture the rent, which leads us also to regulations and standards. Sometimes regulations and standards, and we talked about CAFE standards and so on, are the best way to bring about innovation. The catalytic converter being perhaps just one example. And finally, but perhaps equally important, we've got to have a shared understanding of responsible behavior, of what this is about. It's got to go beyond carrots and sticks. It's got to go beyond marginal this and marginal that. It's really got to be about people understanding why this is important, lobbying their politicians, getting a consensus, not only understanding why it's important to your own country, but also understanding, if you're going to get a global deal, of what matters and what the distributional impacts are for other countries if you're going to try and get them to buy into what is a global problem. I'm going to stop there because I've run out of time, but I'll leave you with a conclusion that you can read at your leisure. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you. I know how it feels when you have to rush. Last year in Korea, I was supposed to give a 25-minute talk, and when I stepped to the stage, it said, "You got 5 minutes." So you did well. Our next speaker is John Wyatt. He's the director and founder of the Energy Modeling Forum at Stanford. And John, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciate the invitation from the Baker Institute to participate in this very important conference. I'm actually going to give a slightly different talk than I originally planned because I detected some momentum in the sessions I've been here at, which were the one right before lunch, and Dimitri's talk. Sorry I couldn't be here sooner. So I'm going to slightly reorient what I was going to say anyway, but I'm going to use the same slides. Those of you who know me know I do this all the time, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So I'll warn you about that. First, some full disclosure. I am the author of a formal review of the Stern Review, which will appear in the Review of Environmental Economics and Policy, brand new journal, soon, they tell me, with another couple of people and a response by Nicholas Stern. Secondly, on the Stern Review, there are 2 papers, at least in the Journal of Economic Literature this year, already out, one by Bill Nordhaus, which discusses the discount rate in more detail. So if you read that, you may either believe Dimitri more or Bill more, but it just goes into more depth. And I'm sure a lot of what Dimitri has written in this area would also be useful to look at. 2 is, I guess I'm the crazy Californian for the afternoon here. I have been working the last year or so. In fact, I met Dimitri at the run-up workshop for the AB 32 required Economic and Technology Advancement Advisory Committee, known as ETAC. So we are actually supposed to figure out what kinds of technology-inducing policies to recommend. Unfortunately, we have our last meeting Monday. The final report is due Tuesday, and it will be delivered to Dan Sperling and the Air Resources Board on the 28th. So you can dial up pretty much as we're going to be able to say on the web right now. That you'll see why I mentioned these 2 items, but I think they're just interesting public interest things in general. I guess the main thing I wanted to do in my talk, which I'm now going to go a little bit of, which I'm going to go harder towards, is in a way kind of a redefinition or recasting of the climate problem, more towards, and we've heard a lot about risk, more towards sort of risk assessment, risk management kind of perspective. Mort Webster will actually give you kind of the quant version of this. I'm going to give you the kind of lead-in and more qualitative review. I think all too often when we discuss policy, particularly the focus of this conference is what are you going to do about it, and is it really expensive or really not expensive? There is this kind of one-for-all debate that comes up. Is we have to do 450, we have to commit to 450 for the whole century and a few centuries beyond right now because we know the danger of not doing so is very dire and the cost of ameliorating or mitigating or adapting is quite low. And I think that's a no-win situation because everybody has already said that you can't predict anything more than 10 years on either side of the equation. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try to do so. It doesn't mean you can't take insights from those kinds of analyses, from global circulation models, or now as they are now called, I've discovered Earth systems models, which have dynamic vegetation alongside the ocean and the atmosphere, or the global economic models, which is what I spend most of my time on. People ask me if I believe a global economic model's projections per se out a century, and I say I don't even believe them out a couple of decades because technologies are changing and all kinds of things could happen. It doesn't mean you can't use them in various useful ways to inform the decisions you need to make today. It just means that if you're going to do a once-for-all formulation with a once-for-all decision, you're going to have problems. I was actually asked by a group of leading climate negotiators once to talk about baseline scenarios and what we know and what we don't know. And I actually started my talk by saying, well, gentlemen and ladies, if you need a perfect baseline forecast of carbon emissions, and that it's what it takes for your particular policy portfolio to be effective, useful, and have a positive benefit-cost ratio, you're in trouble big time. So I think that's kind of the basic message I'm going to try to get across here. It really ties into, I have there's a group in my department that does strategy for firms that work in very uncertain, complex environments. Think Cisco Systems, Google, Intel, et cetera. And they generally, according to her, this very qualitative theory, kind of use a more evolutionary model where there are simple rules that are developed, and essentially you try to promote killing bad ideas quickly and taking good ideas, proliferating them, and recombining them. That leads to two things just right off the bat in terms of climate policy and the cost of climate policies. There were kind of new revelations for me. One is when I heard about California doing a policy and other states doing policies, the EU doing policies, other countries doing policies, U.S. federal government might do something, are doing things. In California, we have 6 or 7 major pieces of legislation that intersect with greenhouse gas emissions. I said, oh my God, this is a nightmare. This can't possibly work. This goes back to the conversation right before lunchtime. I'm now of the view that if you design the policy architecture flexibly, so you can change your mind and redirect on a regular basis, that's not altogether a bad thing, that letting 1,000 flowers bloom and different regions doing what they can do easily politically and resource-wise and economy-wise, because everybody has a different resource base, a different economic structure, and a different set of policies. I can't imagine some states doing what California did. In fact, I couldn't imagine 5 years ago California doing what California has now done. In fact, I couldn't imagine 2 years ago Arnold Schwarzenegger actually being reelected. So there you have it on that front. Second thing, I've been immersed, and Jay Edmonds will actually go full bore into the technology strategy solution to climate change. I've been immersed through the Global Climate Energy Project, and actually even before that through the involvement I had thanks to Jay and the advising on the Global Technology Strategy Project, kind of technologies as a alternative but enhancing set of policies, just as Dimitri left it. I'm going to pick up on that theme big time. And I'm going to link it back to Steve Koonen's comments, believe it or not, because I was shocked to come to the following conclusion, right? You say, well, why do you want technologies? Well, technology is kind of the ultimate option. You can develop them, but you don't have to use them unless the cost of greenhouse gases are high, there are no cheap substitutes, fossil fuel prices are high, et cetera. You can think through that kind of set of contingencies. My surprise is one of the biggest constraints on corporations acting on climate change is policy uncertainty. We heard about the 15 presidential terms. I forgot how that came up. That was just our president, by the way. It wasn't the presidents of all the other countries. So I think we're never going to be in a situation where there's a perfect, credible price signal available over 40 or 50 years. It's never going to happen. Just think about what you're assuming when you assume that. That doesn't mean you give up. That means you do what you can when you can, but you're going to have a lot of ups and downs. You're going to have some administrations that want a carbon tax, some that want a cap and trade. You won't be able to completely move off what the previous people have done, but you're going to cycle like that, and there's going to be better or worse periods. If at the same time, in addition, because climate change is a long-term problem, you're working the technology frontiers, you're doing the pre-competitive things that don't respond as directly to price signals. Most people I know who work in labs at universities and national research labs are kind of motivated by saving the world, publications, promotions, impressing their colleagues and things like that, much more than prices per se. I know Dimitri covered this, but I'm going to really come back hard on that because I think there actually is, surprising to me, my own thinking on this has changed, where I think that this is kind of a little bit more of a reliable policy just because all the other policies are very political and therefore maybe not as sustainable as we would like to think. And I think the corporate world is smart enough to realize that. So we'll try to reduce the variance and set things, and this is part of what we're trying to do in California, set things in place that can't be reversed, but some things are really easy to reverse. New technologies, new knowledge, it's pretty hard to, these days with the internet and different kinds of patent rules and so on, is kind of hard to completely reverse. Okay, now on to just a few slides. I think I'm going to use the 5. How do I click to the next slide? next? Oh, there is a keyboard down there. That was the first thing I was missing, is there is a keyboard down there. So this is going to be kind of a review now, because I recast this talk a little bit. Let me tell you why I gave this talk. This is actually a version of a talk I gave to the Air Resources Board chairman about a year ago. And as many of you who do cost projections, particularly the kind of aggregate ones that I've been involved in the last 15 years or so, you're often asked by various constituencies, well, John, are the costs high or are they low? Step up to the plate. Work group 1 has said the damages from work 1 and 2, damages from climate change are high or low. You have to step up to the plate and say the costs are low also. And I think Dimitri got it right. The real response I have to that is if you do it right, they can be quite low. In fact, I'm going to even go lower than Dimitri on my low side. On the other hand, I have this stinking suspicion, stinking suspicion that some politicians want me. I don't have any liability insurance. They want me to say the costs are going to be 1% or less, or 0, or negative, or 0.1%. And then they can implement the policies any way they please to satisfy all their constituents. And so after going through this a few times, I said to myself, geez, I don't really want to be in this position. So I think the first thing I would say about cost, and I've tried to get this more directly, probably Morton and Jay have too, in the IPCC reports, is the first observation I have is they're very uncertain. They're uncertain because they involve predicting future fuel prices, structure of industry, technology states, and what the policymakers are going to do. Not just our policymakers, that we don't know what they're going to do in the next 2 years, but everybody else's policymakers over a long period of time. So this puts in a very large dose of uncertainty. But we can put some rough bounds on them. We've tried to do that. Those are quite useful. I'll describe why I think that is a useful exercise despite the uncertainties and complexities. We have also discovered some general principles about how to minimize costs. These have to do with just very basic ideas regarding flexibility. Dimitri hit on some, the broader the scope of the cap and trade, and given others before the break. I also think this is back to the evolutionary theory storyline that there will continue to be a lot of learning about both institutions and technologies as we try to implement the transformational policies. So the point there is yet another flexibility. We've talked before about where, when, what, and how flexibility. I'll briefly review those at the end of this talk. But I think there's also what I would call, from the discussion earlier today, kind of a policy flexibility. We have to be willing to admit easily and quickly that we kind of blew it and we need to do something else, or to do things more in a broader scale, or combine two ideas, neither of which works perfectly, to get something better. You're going to tell me, if you're a political scientist, that this is hard to do. I'm tired of hearing that response. I think if we really care about this problem, the entrepreneurs have to work that side of the street as well as the technology side of the street. The kind of institutional entrepreneurship is really, really important. So why do we make these projections? I think we try to ensure internal consistency in putting together a picture of what future energy systems could be and who's got to adjust when and where over a wide range of assumptions. We can put some rough bounds on cost and compare them with cost of other programs and the cost of climate change. You might say, well, this is, and I think this is part of the problem that Dimitri brought up, is the early attempts to aggregate were focused on how do we know how big this problem is relative to other problems, because when you go before the Congress or the international negotiators, they kind of want to know that, is how much do we have to trade off this problem against other problems. So it's not a perfect number, but it's a number you can use to put the issue in the right ballpark at that length. I think the problem that Dimitri highlighted is sometimes people forget that it's just an approximation, and they have left things out, and they meant to revise it going forward, but didn't get around to doing it. I can tell you the original Nordhaus numbers were the result of a conference call with about 6 people on it. I was one of them about 20 years ago, and those have been updated now, but it's kind of survived for 20 years, but they were only supposed to be rough assumptions for about 6 months. We can also provide, and several people have talked about this, including Steve Tunin, we can create benchmarks. So we can figure out what the optimal policies would give us and say, okay, the politics take over. In California, we have environmental justice community. They have their own committee reporting into CARB. Some trade-offs will be necessary. But we probably want those to be less rather than more expensive as we go. So I'll actually just kind of end with the flexibility argument. Many of you have seen this before. This is a study we did at the 2 years after Kyoto, and it's actually the marginal or carbon price projected for the U.S. if the U.S. had joined, ranges from $10 a ton carbon up to $400 a ton. The point of this figure is within each model structure, you can reduce the cost by a factor of 2 to 4 by allowing ever greater amounts of international emissions trading. Number one, you're still left with some uncertainty between the different models, but just this one policy scope assumption has a huge impact on the policy results. To bring this a little bit more to life, there is a bar up there called an EMS bar that has the actual projections by the Energy Information Administration in the US were a little bit over $300 for the high bar, and the SGM results, Jay's model used by the Council of Economic Advisors in the administration, produced a number around $14 to $22 for essentially the global trading case. But those models will differ standardizing assumptions about international emissions trading, but the biggest source of difference is just that one assumed global emissions trading and the other assumed no global emissions trading whatsoever in the way they were implemented. And then you can try to back out the, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. Okay, so here's my bottom line on mitigation costs across all the flexibilities. Where and when you take the emissions, how, technologies, other types of policies besides market, what different greenhouse gas species, Kyoto basket of 6. And that is, stabilization can be achieved at almost any level you want, at some place between 0.1 and 10% of GDP per year. You can get down to this 1% or even lower if you're willing to specify broadly based flexible policies. But you can't guarantee that unless you know what the policy architecture is going to be. If politics dominate in a negative way, you're going to get very narrow investments at very high levels. We heard about a few of them in some of the questions before, and you're likely to get a cost that's 10 times more than that. So I agree with Steve Koonin that we have very little resources available for this juxtaposed against all the other major calls on society resources. So part of our job as analysts, I think, is to keep us on the low end of that range. And when we do the final policy analysis, it's pleasing that the bills before Congress are being addressed this way. I think we need to be as specific as possible, because when we do that, we can at least narrow these cost ranges down to a factor of 2 or 3. Thanks.
Well done. Scott Nyquist, Director of McKinsey and Company here in Houston and a peripatetic traveler in the energy practice.
Keyboards where? Here. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to share some of our work with you all. Just before I get into the slide, just a bit of background on McKinsey and how we kind of stumbled into this whole area. For those of you who don't know, McKinsey is a management consultancy, and we spend most of our time serving large corporations on matters of strategy, organization, and operations. And we have done quite a bit of work in the past 4 or 5 years in the area of greenhouse gases, and that gave us some insight into the economics of greenhouse gas abatement and also just some pure data. So about 2 years ago, we thought it might be useful to conduct a research project on what it might cost to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we did a joint project with Vattenfall, a Swedish utility, to take a global look at what it costs to reduce greenhouse gases, and I'll show that in a minute. Since then, there's a lot of interest in it. We've done deep dives, we call it, into different countries. We've done the UK, Germany, and we did an extensive piece of work looking at the US, which we published and shared. And the goal of all this is just to provide some data at a pretty micro level around what it actually takes to make a tangible difference in this. So what I'm going to do today is just summarize a little bit around the high-level cost, which actually has been shown already. So I'll go through it quickly, and then talk more about the details from the US side. We start with a reference case, and this is looking at total global emissions of gigatons of carbon per year. and going from 40 in 2002 up to 60 in 2030 and 85 by 2050, and need to reduce that by down to 5 to 10, depending on your view, sometime by 2050 or beyond. Since we don't really know what the technology will be in 2050, we chose to look at 2030 as a case that's far enough out that we can see substantial changes in the way our economy works, but near enough that we could actually look at what the technologies that might be available to deploy. We'll skip this one. So this is the curve. I took off the bit that said love it or hate it off there. My version doesn't have that on it, but this was the work that we did with Vattenfall some 2 years ago. And if you take that 60 gigatons of carbon emissions reference case in the year 2030, this shows on the x-axis that there's somewhere 26 to 27 gigatons that we identified that you could be reduced versus that reference case. And let me just describe how the curve works for those who haven't seen it. If you look at that nuclear bar, which is the white bar between 6 and 7, what that says is that compared to the reference case, which is the IEA scenario, we could build a lot more nuclear capacity that would reduce the emissions of carbon by 1 gigaton. And this number of 1 gigaton incremental emissions was based on what experts thought might be practically feasible to put in place between now and 2030. As far as the y-axis goes, the cost to reduce carbon emissions, what we did is we looked at the full life cycle economics of a nuclear plant. What's the capital cost required to build one? What's the operating cost over time? What benefits you're going to get from the price of electricity? And all that compared to a reference plant, which is a coal plant. In this case, nuclear would cost, according to all those assumptions, using a 7% discount factor, some 5 to 10 euros per ton carbon reduced compared to the reference case. So we did that for some 200 different bars, and we put them on a chart. And when you look at the chart, a number of observations come out. One is that, which others have talked about, there is no silver bullet. There's many different opportunities that cut across the economy. Carbon capture and storage is a very important opportunity. It's on the right-hand side of the curve, and all around this $40 to $50 a ton number, so it's a very important one, but is actually not the single silver bullet that will solve all the problems. A lot of attention is placed on the left-hand side of the curve, which is the so-called negative cost due to energy efficiency, and these are opportunities when you compare the way the world is headed in the EIA reference case, lots of opportunities to use energy more efficiently around the world, and if you were to do that, the actual savings using a 7% discount rate for energy was offset the cost of capital investment to achieve these types of savings. So big negative cost opportunity. And when you look at the curve, you can't help it to some area under the curve analysis say that if everything happened here, it would be the cost of the economy would be quite low. Now, from our point of view, we just put the data out there, and as a discussion tool, we use it with clients in a very different way, but it provides some insight for various policymakers that they thought about what the practical options are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that was the global analysis. And we went to the US, and what we did here was we looked at some 250 different opportunities in the US. We covered 7 sectors of the economy: buildings, power, transportation, industrial waste, agriculture, and forestry. We took a lot of the data from US government agencies, which is very good, the DOE, around their energy forecast going forward. And then we had sponsors, which included some corporate sponsors, a range of them for the power sector, as well as from the provider equipment services and oil companies. And then we had NGOs, so very mixed bag, we'll call it, of sponsors for this effort. We had an academic panel to challenge us and give us some feedback along the way. Our job was to kind of gather the facts and then try to persuade this very diverse group of people that the numbers were actually made some sense. What we did look at in this work was man-made emissions within the US borders. We looked at opportunities that would cost less than $50 a ton. And very importantly, we used technologies and approaches with predictable cost and development paths. This was not something that says there's some new technologies coming. This is looking at existing, well-known technologies. We looked at full life cycle cost for the work, looking at net capital, operating and maintenance costs, again, discounted at 7%. So this is very much a bottom-up engineering analysis. We didn't look at anything around importing carbon. We didn't look at the cost to implement all this policy and transaction costs for making all this happen. We didn't look at what the carbon price might do to energy demand. We assume constant consumer lifestyle. There's no issue around people having to consume less energy to do this stuff. Basically the same kind of lifestyle, same SUVs, but just using more efficient technology. And we didn't include any other benefits. So it's very kind of simple analysis, existing technologies, looking at the microeconomics. So this is what the curve looks like for the US. You can see some similarities between the US and the global curve with some notable differences. First of all, there's a much larger energy efficiency opportunity in the US compared to the rest of the world. That surprised us. We somehow thought that the number would be a bit smaller given our extensive power infrastructure. When we show this to Europeans, they say, yes, of course, Americans are so inefficient how they use energy. It's no surprise at all about the size of the left-hand side of the curve there. Enormous opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through efficiency. Very surprised at how large an opportunity there was in consumer electronics, very efficient use of personal computers and TVs and other electronic devices in the US. That are some of the most inefficient uses of energy we have. Big opportunities in fuel economy. Biofuels with cellulosic biofuels coming down the road would be very attractive. And then on the right-hand side again, like we've seen in every country we've done this, you get to the coal analysis, which says that somewhere around $50 a ton is required for carbon capture and storage for coal plants. And it's interesting as we've had different teams kind of look at this work in the 2030 timeframe, assuming some learning curve for this kind of technology. They keep coming up everywhere around the world, roughly in that range, $40 to $50 a ton, and set a cost to build carbon capture and storage into coal plants. And it's always on the right-hand side of the curve. So just to say, we looked at different cases to get different volumes of greenhouse gas reductions. In our mid-range case, what I showed before, that was some 3 gigatons of greenhouse gas reductions versus a business as usual case with 9.7. If we put more aggressive policy changes in place, you could get that up to 4.5 gigatons. And that's getting in line with what proposed legislation is, which is in that range of 3.5 to 5.2 gigatons by 2030. Quite a significant capital investment is required to make all this happen. All these numbers here are embedded in that cost curve, but these are the additional capital requirements to deliver those greenhouse gas abatement options embedded in the curve. It turns out to be roughly $1 trillion of cost between now and 2030, which is about 1.5% of the total capital investment in the US over that time frame. So a big number, but not so big when you look at it compared to other capital expenditure. If you look at just one as an example, the transportation sector, big number, $370 billion of capital employed, and this will come across as auto companies will have to invest more, and that would lead to higher prices for cars, but that higher price of the cars would be offset against the savings you would get through greater fuel efficiency in most of their analysis. Just to show a regional difference, won't spend too much time on this, is just to say that the data set is broken down into different regions and don't make too much into the fact that the Northeast has less number in terms of megatons of reduction than the South, because that has more to do with population of the census areas. But you can see that the shape of the curves are very similar when you go into each region of the US. At a macro level, but when you look at it at a detail level, they're quite a different story. Just one kind of example on that. This shows the geographic differences in abatement potential by sector. So we have each region, West, Midwest, South, Northeast across the bottom, and the top the side would be the sectors. And you can see, for example, in the West, it has some 36% of its opportunity in power. That's because there's a lot of solar opportunities and wind opportunities in the West, so it shows up that being a much larger opportunity set in that region compared to other regions. If you look at the South, big opportunity in buildings and appliances. That's because there's very high population growth in the South, and if you can build new buildings and put efficient appliances in them, you get big opportunities. Take the transport sector, big opportunity in the Northeast, highly dense population that drives a lot. And then in agriculture and forestry, very interesting, a large opportunity in the Midwest just because of the number of acres of land that could be reforested or improved use of emissions reduction through agriculture. So that just gives you a sense for the geographic mix of opportunities across the US. Just very quickly, just going through the curve, looking at it from different cuts. This is one looking at the energy efficiency opportunities, and the light blue shading is the ones that were addressed by the 2007 Energy Independence and Security Act, which suggested that you could put standards in place that would help get these types of opportunities that are shown in this curve here. And you can see that if aggressive standards are put in place as a result of that bill, that would help out a number of the energy efficiency opportunities, but there are also several in the dark blue case that aren't being addressed yet by any bill that we've seen. Then if we look at low carbon technology and infrastructure, the biggest story here, which I already mentioned, is the right-hand side. You get into the coal area, and if we are able to get this carbon capture storage technology developed, there are big opportunities at the high end of the cost curve to make that a real opportunity. And of course, if we don't, it makes it very difficult to meet the targets that are implicit in the 2030 timeframe. Carbon sink and other industrial potential. The U.S. has a smaller share of carbon sink compared to the rest of the world. Big opportunities in the rest of the world are just stopping deforestation, but it's surprising how much opportunity there is in the U.S. to forest cropland, to use active forest management to improve the greenhouse gas emissions capability of across the U.S. And these are middling type opportunities. There's also a number of opportunities in the industrial side that with the right kind of incentives that they could be brought forward. Anyways, going through it quickly, but just a sense for the kinds of opportunities when you look at these curves. Let me just summarize. The purpose of this effort really was just to give a fact base, but just some comments on policy. That when you get into the numbers, you can't help yourself, even though we're not policy experts, just seeing some of the policy implications for this work. And one is it's very clear, which others have said, you need to have some notion of targets of what you're trying to achieve. You need some market mechanism, cap and trade or carbon tax, to actually make sure there's a price out there. But also it struck us when we did this work how that would just be insufficient. You would not be able to get the opportunities that came out of this analysis if that's all we did. And in energy efficiency, lots of history around this won't happen with just price unless you get the prices extremely high, and other mechanisms to influence consumer behavior to adopt those kinds of measures would be required. Carbon sinks requires a special set of rules and regulations to encourage people both inside the U.S. and around the world to leverage that opportunity. And then finally, low carbon technology. One of the things that struck us as we did this work was just how important very basic things like permitting. Can you permit a nuclear plant? Can you permit pipelines? Can you get the carbon dioxide liability for carbon capture storage sorted? And if you can get those things, you can see how investments could be put in place over the next 15, 20 years that would actually deliver significant improvements in emissions. But if we can't, it won't happen. And then there's this whole issue around how do you incent technology, and some very good discussion earlier today around what kind of innovation policies would be required. So these are just the kinds of policy issues that came out when we did the work. Again, this is not a policy paper, it's more of a data set paper, and we just include this chart here just to show some examples of the kinds of issues that came out when we did the work. Okay, thank you very much.
Speaking of efficiency, our next speaker is my colleague Peter Hartley. He's been a versatile scholar of energy for a quarter century. He is the George and Cynthia Mitchell Professor of Economics, and he is the director of the Shell Center for Sustainability. Peter?
Thank you very much. This reflects joint work with my partner Ken Madlock, although I'm responsible for all the silly things I'm going to say. But reflects a lot of things a lot of conversations Ken and I have had, plus some of the specific work I'm going to talk about. Now, at the risk of complicating things, I'm going to introduce, well, I guess people have mentioned it already, but talk about a second sort of externality, namely energy security is another possible issue we have to worry about in thinking about climate policy. This reflects actually a lot of work we've done over the years at the Baker Institute in thinking about energy markets and the interaction of energy markets with geopolitics. So what I'm going to suggest is that there's a significant interaction between policies that affect climate and policies that affect energy security. But I'm also going to suggest that there are policy options that enable you to address both of those things at the same time. So the departure point for this is actually a quote from Tony Blair, who mentioned in October 2006, "We must treat energy security and climate security as two sides of the same coin." And the issue is, well, what's the basis for that claim? So, of course, dependence on imported sources of energy can have negative macroeconomic and strategic consequences. I'm going to talk about that as the energy security externality, if you like. Most of these imported sources are fossil fuels, and of course, burning them increases CO2 emissions, contributing to global climate change, as we've been discussing. The US can reduce both of these undesirable consequences by reducing its fossil fuel use. So that argument has some merit, but it also has one flaw, we argue, but you can handle it by appropriate set of policies. So we're going to focus here mainly on the United States. So the first thing is I want to talk a little bit about is what are the possible meanings of energy security. So what can we mean when we talk about energy security as a problem? So one is it's related to national security as usually interpreted. So indeed, the time Tony Blair was speaking, a widely reported sentiment was that the United States got heavily involved in Iraq and more generally has been involved in the Middle East because a lot of our oil, a lot of the Western world's oil comes from that area, and the US has to spend a lot on military forces to maintain the flow of that oil. Another notion related to national security is that we also have other areas where the US doesn't necessarily send military forces like Venezuela or West Africa, but those countries also have some political instability which affects the flow of energy out of those countries. And of course the other related issue is that modern military forces actually require a substantial amount of oil. In the case of the US, 130 to 140 million barrels of oil a year actually, and it's the biggest single purchaser of oil products actually in the world. Energy security is also related, however, to economic security, and this relates to work that we've done at the Baker Institute on looking at the energy security in Japan, where we undertook an analysis of the Japanese economy, and we sort of found that if you look at including nuclear power in the electric generating mix, that it reduces the fluctuation in prices of energy that you would otherwise makes them lower than you would otherwise have, and that contributes to macroeconomic stability. And then, of course, another problem that is related to energy markets and security is that when you have these big changes in oil prices, it actually leads to large financial flows, and in the past, those large financial flows, recycling them have been associated with various financial disruptions, possibly like we're going to have again right now. And finally, price uncertainty actually further reduces investment in safer sources of supply domestically. So one thing that makes the energy industry more risky is if the energy prices fluctuate a lot. And that also ends up being like a tax on investment, so to speak. So that's like an externality because an individual firm doesn't have an incentive to take account of those macroeconomic effects or those strategic effects in its own decisions. But what are some policies that you could use to promote energy security? Of course, in the short run, we can have emergency stocks like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. But more generally, what we argue is that, as in the case with the Japanese example, that having lots of sources of supply and having, both in terms of the type of energy source that you're using, the type of fuel, also in terms of the linkages between customers, the number of suppliers and the number of demanders, and having sort of an integrated world market where you can absorb these various shocks by changing the trade pattern. All of those things contribute to energy security. But the one that's of particular interest here is the greater variety of energy supply sources. And of course, related to the previous discussion, the McKinsey analysis, the other big contributor to energy security is energy efficiency. So increased energy efficiency will also reduces vulnerability to energy price shocks. And part of the story on this slide is to make the point that the possibilities for increasing energy efficiency actually are very widely dispersed throughout the economy. There are many, many different ways that you can increase energy efficiency. And it includes, for example, altered business practices. So the case of Walmart was mentioned, and Walmart found that by studying how they send their trucks around the country carrying goods around, they can actually make big savings in fuel efficiency. So it's not just technological changes, it can also be changes in business practices and so on. The argument then is that because energy efficiency can be increased in many, many ways, rather than mandating specific changes, a good way of bringing about a lot of energy efficiency changes is to raise the price of energy. So indeed, it's been pointed out earlier that Japan and Western Europe have higher energy efficiency than the United States, and of course they have had higher taxes on energy for a longer period of time, and it's those high taxes encourage people to conserve. So I'm going to come back to that point. The United States having much lower taxes on energy has led to lower energy efficiency here than in Europe and Japan. So that's one side of the coin is energy security. The other side of the coin is climate policy, and we want to talk about the relationship between the two. So when it comes to climate policy, this has already been discussed, although I guess the last time, one of the sessions this morning, we talked about some of these alternative approaches to climate policy. Most of the discussion since then has only been on controlling the emissions of greenhouse gases. But in fact, there's been some discussion of sequestration, I guess. But people haven't really talked about the last 2 points, at least the last couple of sessions we haven't. So I want to focus my remarks mainly on those last 2 points, although I just mentioned again, most of these points have already been covered by previous speakers. But when you start to talk about reducing emissions, you do have to pay attention to the possibility of carbon leakage. The other point is that I want to come back to is we want to talk about the relationship between reducing emissions in terms of changing the fuel mix and the interaction that might have with energy security. Before I talk some more about that, make a few more remarks about mitigation and remediation. This is a little bit different, I think, than the way the word mitigation was used this morning. But what I mean by mitigation here is measures to reduce the likelihood of large damages from climate incidents. So building dikes to protect vulnerable coastlines, for example, or improving evacuation plans and procedures, changing building codes, developing crops, which was discussed earlier, developing crops that are more resistant to altered climate, and of course removing subsidies to activities that increase the harm, such as encouraging people to live in the path of hurricanes or in floodplains and so forth. And by remediation of damages, I'm thinking of better disaster relief preparation, improved cooperation between disaster relief teams, overcoming the sorts of problems we saw after Katrina, of course, some of those activities would also have other benefits, in particular improved remediation of damages, the sort of activities I'm talking about there at the bottom of the slide, would also be beneficial for other events like earthquakes, fires and so forth, not just climate events. Okay, I want to, maybe in the interest of time, move on. The only issue I make from this slide is that one thing to think about in terms of talking about mitigation and remediation, these issues, is that they also help protect, of course, against other sources of climate change, other than just CO2. So insofar as there are natural components of climate change or other things that people are doing that affect climate, other than emitting CO2, the mitigation and remediation measures would also help protect against those sources of climate change. Okay, so the key issue I wanted to talk about is, are policies towards energy security and climate change complementary? Are they two sides of the same coin? And clearly, increases in energy efficiency would serve both goals. If you can increase energy efficiency, It's going to reduce the dependence on foreign sources of energy, but it will also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, increasing the use of non-fossil sources of energy will also serve both policy goals. And in fact, one could argue that in the long term, new energy technologies are actually essential for both of these areas. As Rick Smalley used to say, that what we have is a terawatt challenge. What we need to do is bring to the table, in the end, to solve the climate problem and actually to solve energy security problem. In the long term, we have to have a terawatt of clean, affordable energy. And the only one on the horizon, he used to argue, was solar. And for that, we really need to make some more basic advances in basic technology. Of course, he used to argue that nanotechnology would help both with the problem of giving us affordable, large-scale solar power, but also another thing that comes along with that would be improvements in storage technology and improvements in electric transmission. And all of those things, he argued nanotechnology could help with all of those problems. But we do need to have a sort of basic investment in the basic science in order to bring that about. If we can bring that about in a matter of the next few decades, we will actually solve both the energy problem and the energy security problem and the climate change problem at the same time. Okay, when it comes to the United States, though, there's a bit of a dilemma when we start to think about energy security and climate change together. And the dilemma is illustrated in this particular picture, which gives us the, so on the top left here, we've got proved recoverable reserves of coal. And one thing you'll notice is that this wedge of the pie here is the United States, which has 29% of the world's proven recoverable reserves of coal, according to the World Energy Council. And of course, the other ones here are China, the brown, I guess there's actually a button here, right? So this one here is China, and this one's Russia. So when it comes to the United States, coal actually is a major energy source. And if you look at the bottom pie chart down here, this is like what they call the World Energy Council bitumen oil, but it's also the tar sands in Canada. And one thing you notice is that this big red part of the pie is actually Canada, which has 73% of the resources of tar sands. And if we look at the top right is shale oil resources, and what you'll notice there is that the United States has 74% of the shale oil resources. So, of course, the big problem here is that coal, shale oil, and tar sands are all far more carbon-intensive, CO2-intensive ways of generating energy, useful energy. And down the bottom right, it compares the total tar sands and oil shale to known reserves or current reserves of oil and natural gas. And we can actually see there's actually a lot of energy in those resources. So the problem here is that one thing that would give North America energy security is, of course, using coal, the Canadian tar sands, and oil shale. But that's definitely not the other side of the coin to a climate change policy. Okay, so what Ken and I did was looking specifically at electricity generation. And one thing you notice is, again, that the United States gets a lot of, as has been mentioned before, a lot of its electricity comes from coal. And in fact, the EIA down the bottom has the projected increase in new generation capacity. The growth, this is the average annual growth rate over the period 2005 to 2030. And what you can see is, again, there's a big growth in coal, because that's the blue bar on the left, because the United States has a lot of coal. Okay, and I'm going to skip through the models. You can get the details from the Baker Institute website. But what we did was we looked at those projections of what's going to happen to electricity generation and what it implies for US LNG imports. And what you can see is that the blue down here is LNG imports, the LNG share of natural gas demand in the United States. Okay, the green line here is the percentage of US natural gas that's expected to be supplied by LNG imports. So one thing you can see is that under this scenario, the United States is going to become much more dependent on natural gas for its energy supply system, just like it currently is with oil. And where's a lot of that natural gas going to come from? In the green here is the Middle East, so a lot of it's also going to come from the same place that oil comes from. So it raises the same kind of energy security issues that come up with oil. We can ask if we're going to shift our power system much more towards or sort of away from coal, so we're going to say all that capacity was going to be coal, if it's instead natural gas, what are the implications? And what this shows is that this is the projected increase in LNG imports. The red here is Alaska, building an Alaskan pipeline, increase in natural gas from Alaska. If you don't allow the Alaskan pipeline, all of that would also be LNG. So we'd have an increase of close to sort of between 1.5 and 2 TCF a year in 2030. So the question is, what can we do that might be able to handle both of these problems at once? And what we want to do is, so what I've graphed along here are policies that affect climate change and policies that affect energy security. And the win-win ones, obviously up here, are increased energy efficiency and increased non-fossil energy. And so what I want to do, just finally then, is to think about two different policies. So actually I'm going to throw in a different policy that hadn't been discussed up until now, which is instead of either having a carbon cap and trade system where you have carbon permits, emission permits, or a carbon tax, another thing you can do is you can have a tax on energy, which is what they've had in Europe and Japan for a long time, and has achieved, as we pointed out, a big increase in energy efficiency. And we want to think about this for a moment. What's the difference between a tax on carbon and a tax on energy? Well, one way of thinking of a tax on carbon is that it's a tax on energy with rebates back to companies depending on how little carbon is used to produce the energy. And so what can you do instead if you just taxed energy? So instead of making the rebates back to the companies depending on how little carbon or how much carbon is in the energy source, you could use some of that revenue to finance basic research into things like we talked about, solar, large-scale solar, electricity transmission, and energy storage and so on. So part of the point here is that if you're going to have a tax on carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, what that's tending to do, it's going to encourage whatever's at the margin going to be less CO2 intensive. So in the current case, for example, it's wind. But we're probably not going to solve the climate problem and the energy security problem with wind. So if instead of rebating that revenue, so to speak, back to subsidise the addition of wind generation, if what you do is you use it to finance basic research into the science that's needed to solve the solar problem, it may be far more effective. And the other problem, of course, is that if you use the CO2 tax, it's going to favour the shift to gas in the short run, which is going to have problems for energy security. Okay. So, concluding remarks. Policies to address climate change and energy security are not necessarily two sides of the same coin. For the US at least, the goals are as likely to conflict as coincide. While some measures further one goal with little effect on the remaining goal, perhaps the conflict in goals is less significant in Europe and Japan, where these more CO2-intensive energy sources are less available. But mitigation, remediation and sequestration address climate change without affecting energy security and alternatives. And I should have mentioned that's the other thing you can do, of course, with the energy tax, is you can use the revenue for mitigation and remediation, as well as for research into something like solar. The goals are more complementary when it comes to encouraging energy efficiency and non-fossil sources, but I suggest the best way of doing that is to tax energy directly and then use the revenue to finance the basic research we need and also to finance some of these mitigation and remediation strategies. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks to you fellows. We're about right back on schedule. Congratulations. Our final speaker before our questions is Mort Webster, who's at MIT in the Joint Program on Science and Policy of Global Change.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor to be participating, especially with all the other distinguished speakers up here today. It's a little hard going towards the end of the day because, especially with such a good set of people, because a lot of the points I was going to make have been touched on to various degrees by folks earlier in the day. So I hope I can build on the shoulders of giants and not make you feel like I'm repeating too much. What I'd like to talk to you about today is, first I want to start off with, in the setup, to clarify one of the things that happens when you talk about climate policy, as we're doing all day today, is that there are a lot of different policy questions relevant to climate change, and different analyses that a lot of us do relate to one or another of those questions, and they're different from each other. And so I want to try to be a little bit clear. I want to pick out 3 of the many questions that face us and show you a little bit about insights that come from my work looking at risk assessment, uncertainty assessment, and decision analysis. I'm going to talk a little bit about the particular model that we've used to do this analysis at MIT. And then I'll show you just very briefly some highlights, some insights that come from doing some detailed work on the uncertainty in this coupled model, which includes both the science and the economics. So let's stop for a moment and think about, we've been talking about a lot of different things today. Sometimes we're talking about a long-term target. One of the questions, and this is framed right in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, signed in '92, is that the long-term goal, as specified in the UN process, is stabilization of greenhouse gases at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. What should that level be? Oops, I'm going the wrong way. That's one question. A different question, which we're also spending a lot of time worrying about, is what should we be doing in the next 20, 30, 40 years? That's driving a lot of the debate in the Bali process. That's driving a lot of the debate in the US Congress on the various bills that have been proposed. Finally, at the detail level, either in the EU or at the US, when you're designing domestic policy, even having agreed upon the level of effort you want to undertake to reduce emissions, the design of those instruments, and some previous speakers, including Gib Metcalf, have already touched on this, but the design of those policies are also important. What I want to do is very briefly today show you how considering the uncertainty explicitly and doing some very careful mathematical analysis can give you insights into how to address each of these questions. So just a little bit very briefly about the model. It's a very busy diagram, so I apologize. This is the standard one we're supposed to show. The Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change at MIT is a large research program that involves social scientists and physical scientists from pretty much across the spectrum, and they have come together over a good number of years now and developed what is called an integrated assessment model. So a fairly detailed, computable general equilibrium model of the global economy and the energy system, and a very complicated system model with a lot of the physical dynamics in the atmosphere, the ocean, the biosphere, and all the feedbacks, interconnections. And when you use this model, there are a lot of assumptions, and we typically do analysis to think about the long-term questions. We do analysis out 100 years, and I think we've seen some other results from analyses today that go out 100 years. You're talking about projecting the global economic system for 100 years, and John Wyant did a nice job pointing out how difficult it is to get it right for a few years. And then all of the uncertainties and weaknesses in our understanding of the Earth system models, as much progress as we've made, there's a lot of uncertainty in these assessments. So to illustrate this, I'll just show you some analysis. We did this at MIT. This was part of the climate change science program, Science and Assessment Report 2.1 that was put together on stabilization. So if you think about the long-term question, where should we be stabilizing? You could take a model like MIT's, and you could do this with other models, and you could say, well, given what we want concentrations to do in our model of the carbon cycle, what should global emissions be so that we hit that target? And also, what is a cost-effective way to spread that out over time so that we hit the target at essentially the least cost in terms of distribution over time. And you might get paths like this. And then you might take a coupled model like the MIT model, and you might say, well, what does that do to global temperature? What are we getting? What are we buying for these various levels of emissions reductions? And you can run it through, and you can look at projections of global mean temperature out 100 years and say, well, there you go. There's the answer. And of course, if you can further add some economic valuation of the damages associated with these levels of warming, you could do a cost-benefit analysis and decide which of these levels is the right one to shoot for, right? Well, it's not that easy. Because of all these uncertainties that we've talked about, any one of those paths that I've shown you are in fact quite uncertain. If you're going out 100 years, both from the physical science and from the economics in terms of economic growth, population growth, and the various technological uncertainties, this is the result of a recent Monte Carlo analysis we've been doing on this integrated modeling framework, where we spend a lot of time very carefully developing descriptions of the uncertainty and all the input assumptions and propagating it through the system. And this first curve shows you what the uncertainty would be in global mean temperature in 100 years if no one does anything, okay? And that's just a reference point. Now, first thing to note is that it's frighteningly high. I think this is along the lines of the IPCC reports and not inconsistent with some of the numbers that Dimitri put up. But this is a probability distribution based on one model's analysis. Now, what does stabilization get you? What it does is it lowers, let's see if I can find the, can I get this to work? How does this work? Oh, there we go. Note what happens is the area under the curve of the low probability but very extreme high warming impacts, that probability gets lowered. You pull down the tail. But it is not the case that even under a 750 or a 550 that you can say exactly what the global mean temperature change is. This picture actually is a nice way to show the importance of what Dean Birnbaum this morning was talking about, the importance of the adaptation side, so managing the unavoidable. Because even if we do a policy, and this is just in terms of global mean temperature, not detailed physical impacts, there's a lot of uncertainty here. Now, folks have talked a few times today about how do we communicate this to policymakers, to the public. I will tell you, having done this work, that it's safe to show probability density functions at Rice University. It's not quite so easy in Washington. We've experimented with some different forms of how to communicate this. Here's just one that we've been experimenting with, where you might say it's like a roulette wheel, a climate change wheel of fortune. And this is the same information in that first, the no policy probability distribution, but put sort of grouped into some bins of temperature change in 100 years. And you can frame this by saying, it's a little bit of a cartoon, you can say, well, you get one spin. So you could spin this wheel, or if you want to stabilize at 750, you can spin this wheel instead. I know it's a little hard to read, but note that these really bad outcome slices are much thinner, and you might worry less about landing on them than you would here. You could even spin the 550 wheel if you're willing to pay more. So how much are you willing to pay to spin one of these wheels instead of this one? That's one way to frame people's thinking. But that's not quite the right way. So now I'm going to go back to what John Wyatt was saying a little while ago, which is that it's not really the right way to think about it that we get one shot for 100 years and we can't reverse. Because policy decisions will adapt, and that's a good thing, and we will hopefully learn and reduce these uncertainties along the way. Now, there was discussion earlier about what's the right time frame. I would agree that 5 years is not a good policy design. 5-year windows, even 10-year windows may be a bit short. If you don't give some sort of regulatory certainty, whether that's 20 years or 30 years or 40 years is not my expertise, but going out 50 or 100 years, we're not going to lock it into place, and that's a good thing. So then the real question is, what should we be doing for the next 30 years or so in the US through the Bali process if given that we're uncertain today, but we're going to reduce uncertainty and we can revise later? That's the real question. And I've done some work on this. Others have done some work on this. You can develop stochastic or uncertain versions of these integrated models And you can actually look at what if there are different possible states of the world, and you don't know what you're in the early phase, but along the way you're going to reduce that uncertainty, and ultimately you'll know and do the right thing. But the question is, what should you be doing in the meantime? And I'm just going to show you one highlight result out of this work from a paper we just published in Climatic Change. So, for example, if you were to go for a target that a few people have mentioned, that we want to stabilize, we want to not exceed 2 degrees temperature change over the next century, if that's your goal, what is the right level of a carbon tax for the next 10, 20 years, just to get a sense of the effort? And then the question is, suppose that uncertainty were to go away either in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or 40 years or 50 years. In each of those cases, essentially what I'm asking is, to go back, what is this level right here? Depending on when I will learn about this and revise. Oops. And what happens is, if you can find out very quickly and reduce that uncertainty, then you would set a lower carbon tax today. You would basically do a less stringent policy because you will learn and you could adapt. But what you see is that if it takes more than about 20 years, under the assumptions of this model, then it's as if you never learn, right? Why? Because if you really want to stay under 2 degrees, and you don't start aggressively enough, because of the irreversibilities in the system, you'll never be able to suck that carbon back in. And you can't afford to be precautionary. So the lesson is, thanks. So the lesson is, if you think you're going to learn, just get my bearings here. If you think you're going to learn, it depends on when you think you're going to learn, and it depends on what your target is. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't do anything today, or even that we do less. That it's very much dependent on these assumptions. The final thing, and I'm going to have to go through this quickly, is I wanted to share with you some work that we're doing to look at the design of specific regulations. There are a lot of bills in Congress. 2 of the prominent ones, these are not the only ones, are the Lieberman-Warner and the Bingham-Inspector bills. And they have converged a lot over the last year of negotiations between the 2 groups of congressmen who are working on them and their staff members. And essentially, they've converged to the point where what's the main disagreement is what we call cost containment. And cost containment basically is the question of what happens if you set some target and then things are more expensive than you originally thought they were going to be. Things cost much more. And the basic difference is that Bingham-Inspector has a safety valve, which says that if the price goes above some preset level, then we will issue more tons above the initial allowance at that price, which essentially sets a ceiling price. Whereas Lieberman-Warner has various mechanisms that essentially form borrowing, where what we do is we allow ourselves to emit more, but we have to make it up later. What I'm going to do, because of the shortness of time, is skip all the way to the end, if you'll bear with me, and I'll show you the punchline, and we can wrap up and get to the discussion. So bear with me, and I'll show you that slide. Okay, here's the punchline. If folks are interested, contact me and I can show you more details. If you compare under uncertainty, when you're not sure what the carbon price is going to be in that first year, and you compare borrowing versus a safety valve, the safety valve does basically about as well as borrowing unless you set a very low carbon price. If you set the carbon price around what you expected your cap to be or above it, the differences are quite small. But if you think that you really want to sneak through a low carbon tax and you set a very low carbon tax, that's where you get into trouble. And so I'll just put the summary up here and close there. Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, now we ask all of our speakers to return up here. So for some questions. And a little ground rules, because of the time of day and because we've almost gotten back on schedule. 1 question per customer. No 2-part questions. Is everybody exhausted? Oh, here we go.
This question is for Mr. Nyquist. I was curious about your McKinsey curve. I have various analysis on it, but what I was curious about was it seemed that those were net gains and losses on kind of a macro level. And I was thinking that for it to be viable to say that you've got sort of net gains and losses of zero on an overall level, you'd have to make the net gains and losses on like an individual level or an entity level, because it seems like some entities would lose more and some entities would gain more. And so how would you suggest you sort of redistribute those gains and losses?
Oh, that's what makes it so fun. There are huge winners and losers in this thing. And what that really says is that energy consumers who make the right investments, either because they're mandated to do so or do so on their own, actually are huge winners just by being more energy efficient. And that those who will make huge investments at the higher end of the cost curve, if the regulatory mechanisms aren't put in place to get them compensated for that, will be losers. So we did not address any of this notion of who wins and loses in this thing, but you can see how the cash could move around the curve depending on policies.
Question over here.
Hi, I've always been puzzled by how you calculate the cost of mitigation and solutions to climate change. And let me give you an example. I mean, we're entering a period where we're entering an energy pinch, which may get to be more of a pinch. And energy prices are going up all through the roof. What if it turns out that non-carbon energy sources are cheaper than the carbon energy sources?
Do you want to? I can partly address that. I didn't show, partly for shortage of time, trying to get back on schedule, the equivalent probability distributions in cost. I think John mentioned it and Dimitri mentioned it. If you do an analysis and you get the economics right, then that is captured. One of the reasons for lower costs in emissions reductions is if you think that energy prices are very high, then it's much less costly then to switch away from them. So it depends on what you're actually in worse trouble if energy prices are low. It's much more expensive then to abate. So
yeah, we've done those same kind of calculations. Sometimes they're not done, but you can do them. And, an interesting fact about the world is almost every other sector you're working for lower cost over time as opposed to higher cost, which we seem to be. Our mindset is always we're kind of adding the social benefits in, but it may turn out with nanotechnologies and the memory of our departed colleagues that actually turns out to be cheaper in the long run than fossil fuels would be, even without the externalities internalized.
Well, I mean, it's not just nanotechnologies, it's global politics. I mean, it's not just Saudi Arabia and other Middle East, it's Venezuela. It's so tempting to hold on to a short supply of energy. So it's just really hard for me to understand how you can actually come up with a number. And it's not just the 100-year thing, it's more like the 17-year thing.
So when we did our 30-year analysis, we just take assumptions on oil prices and gas prices and power prices, and then the relative economics of solar comes out of that, given a view around how technology develops. And then when oil prices go higher, solar looks a lot better. And you can see, so in our little micro-analysis, solar wins in a big way when oil prices and energy prices in general go up, just as you were suggesting.
Two more questions. Amy?
I wanted to, it sounds like I'm favoring Peter, but we have this great panel here. So I wanted to just open up the question because all the debate is around costing out carbon. So I just wanted to get the panel's reaction to this idea. Suppose we just completely taxed energy so that its use was more efficient. And suppose we did pick a winner. Suppose we decided that solar was the winner and that was the one energy form we didn't tax. Do you think that that could be as effective as trying to create this entire carbon system where you're going to have political people and different industries sort of vying against each other, right? Would it be just much simpler to have this giant energy tax that propelled efficiency and then say just not have that tax on solar?
Who's going to take that first?
Well, I'll start. And just a couple of reactions. We don't think it would work particularly well, and the reasons would be, if you even compare to Europe with very high energy taxes, they still have an enormous efficiency opportunity, not as big as ours because they have higher prices. So we found that price on its own still hasn't eliminated the efficiency opportunity. And we've also found that the way you can really get by 2030 time frame low cost of things like carbon capture storage, it's not through a tax system, but it's through finding techniques to accelerate innovation and streamlining permitting procedures and a lot of mundane kind of detailed siting issues. So only if policymakers take a very holistic view and think of policies across the spectrum can they really drive down costs, and any kind of blunt instrument will lead to higher costs in our view overall.
Higher prices, though, do call for innovation. You see that in gas recovery.
We haven't seen it in energy efficiency.
Well, I mean, first of all, my first reaction is if you're trying to tax the externality, you should be going for greenhouse gas intensive rather than all of energy. Energy per se is not a bad thing. Secondly, I mean, the usual response to picking winners is, two responses. One is we can't know what's going to be the cheap technology of the future. The second is that, there is a good incentive. It goes back to John's, what, where, when, how, flexibility. The more options you have on the table, the broader the portfolio, the less likely you are to hit against the steep part of the abatement curve. As you roll out any technology, there's only so many feasible. I mean, on the one hand, you have the induced innovation. The more you roll out the technology, you get economies of scale and you get reductions in prices through learning and experience. On the other hand, however, you do have the opposite effect that you will run out of suitable sites for wind farms or for solar power, or you will run out of the right number of technicians. There are only finite. There are increasing returns as well. So you've got to trade off the intertemporal dynamics where costs come down with the spatial ones where if you just put all your eggs in one basket, you just your costs start increasing. So that will be an argument against picking winners.
The only point the point I was trying to make here is that one of the consequences of the CO2 tax, at least in the short to intermediate run, is going to be a huge increase in the demand for natural gas relative to other fossil fuels, because amongst all the fossil fuels, natural gas is the lowest CO2 intensive source, and that does have consequences for energy security. That's my other point. There's an extra externality here that associated with, if you have these heavy taxes on CO2, it's going to really encourage the use of natural gas versus other fossil fuels.
Actually, tying a couple of those together, another argument you could make, and probably I've already thought of, is I always worry about kind of the low tax carbon strategy, just inducing people to get really good at gas switching, but not much beyond that. So one could also make that, I think on the climate side, you could make that argument that it would be better to not do things that induce that as our first and only best policy response.
Scott, just a real simple question. Have you guys looked at the sensitivity of the shape of your curve to the discount rate that you use?
Yeah, we have it. It moves over quite a lot. If you put 25% discount rates, for example, on energy efficiency, which some people say it makes a number of those opportunities, not negative anymore, positive. But that's so we can show you that offline if you'd be interested.
Yeah, I'm just curious in general what it does to the price of carbon.
Oh yeah.
Actually, if I could, one slide I didn't show that I meant to show is kind of my punchline from my original talk, and that was comparing bottom-up and top-down mitigation cost curves. This was actually published in the IPCC report, and it is amazing how many gigatons of either negative or very low cost, negative sometimes from the point of view of the bottom up, and extremely low cost from the top-down models. Those now are almost equivalent. So I think either way, if you're willing to pay even a little bit of price premium at maybe a high discount price, there still seems to be a lot there just waiting to be picked off somehow, some way. I think that's part of the sequential decision making is rather than arguing endlessly about the end game, you just do those billion or 2 billion or 3 billion tons. A lot of those are probably the light and dark blues for what I've seen on your diagram.
Amy, Neil, how long will the break be? "15 minutes. So that means you should be back here at 3:12. Is that right? 4:12? 4:12.